Good day. This is Lawrence Holgate, author of the Smart Students Guides series, and we're reading from Understanding John Locke, the Smart Students Guide to Locke's second treatise of government. We've done the first chapter. We're on chapter 2 in the book with the title, The State of Nature. And just to jump right into it, Locke claims that we cannot understand political power unless we find its origin. And he doesn't defend this claim. Instead, he immediately says two things. First, that the origin of political power is to be found in the state of nature, or to quote Locke, the state that all men are naturally in. And secondly, this state or condition is one of freedom and equality. In fact, perfect freedom, as Locke puts it. Let's talk about that first, perfect freedom. By the words state of nature, Locke means that the condition that humans are in pre-politically, prior to the introduction of a legal system, and of course the man-made rules that a legal system would require everyone to obey. So it's a pre-political condition. In the state of nature, there are no man-made rules or laws. There is only the law of nature. And if we ask Locke, what is it that men have this perfect freedom to do? He replies in paragraph 4 of the second treatise. He says they have the perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. End quote. For example, in the state of nature, I am free to do what I wish. I am free to use the things that I possess, and I can even dispose of my body as I wish without asking the permission of anybody. Of course, someone much stronger than I can bully or force me to do something I do not want to do. But in the state of nature, that person has no right. That is, they have no power, no authority to do this. So power does not mean force. It means having the right to do something. Locke also adds a caveat in paragraph 4 when he writes that people in the state of nature must keep their behavior within the bounds of the law of nature. And this exception immediately prompts us to ask two questions. What is the law of nature, and how can I have perfect freedom to do as I wish and at the same time be bound by the law of nature? Locke doesn't answer that first question, what is the law of nature, until a later paragraph. We'll come to it shortly. And we have to wait for some time for an answer to the second question. That is, how can I have perfect freedom to do as I wish and at the same time be bound by the law of nature? If asked, what does it mean to say that all persons in the state of nature are equal? Locke replies that all the power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, no one having more than another. That's what he means by equality. He means that we are equal when all the power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, no one having more than another. Locke is talking about moral, not physical or intellectual equality. We are all equal in the sense that we all have the same moral rights, not in the sense that we are equally strong or equally intelligent. He does not mean that. If you have a right to life or liberty, then everyone else possesses these rights. That's what he means by reciprocity. If you have a right to life or liberty, then I have a right to liberty, and so does everybody else. His argument for this is that all of us are of the human species. We are born, quote, to the same advantages of nature, and we have the use of the same faculties. If we should dispute some of these factual claims, for example, by pointing out that some people are much more intelligent than other people, Locke would probably reply that even ceding this point, it is only God, as, quote, the Lord and Master of them all, who could give a person sovereignty over others, and we have no evidence that God has declared that smart people, for example, the smart students are reading or listening to this book, that these smart people, meaning you, have a right to dominion over those who are not as smart. He does not mean that at all. then something happens here. In the next paragraph of Second Treatise, paragraph 5, Locke quotes Richard Hooker, who wrote 100 years earlier that the equality of men by nature is evident in itself and beyond all question. The equality of men by nature is evident in itself and beyond all question. Locke comments that this equality is the foundation of the obligation to mutual love among men, on which Hooker builds the duties they owe to one another, and from whence Hooker, derives the great maxims of justice of clarity. By the way, when Locke says that a claim is self-evident, as he just said, when he was talking about Hooker, by self-evident, a claim is self-evident when it is analytically true. That is true by definition. The meaning of the words alone will determine whether the claim is true or false. You don't have to go outside those words, to determine this. And the question for Hooker is whether his claim that all men are equal can be confirmed as true in the same way that, for example, all triangles are three-sided could be confirmed as true. Think about that, okay? Back to the book. If we accept Hooker's claim that all men are equal, then any duty that I believe is owed to me is also a duty that I owe to you. The word equality implies equality of moral duties. If I say, for example, that you have a duty to come to my aid in times of distress, then I imply that I and everyone else has the same duty under the same circumstances. And here's another quote, and this time it's straight from Hooker. Foreseeing those things which are equal must needs all have one measure. If I cannot but wish to receive good, even as much at every man's hand as any man can wish unto his own soul, how should I look to have any part of my desire herein satisfied, unless myself be careful to satisfy the like desire? By the way, end quote. That's the reciprocity he's talking about. If I look to have any part of what I want, what I desire, to be satisfied, then I have to be careful myself to satisfy the like desire from someone else. Locke points out that Hooker later derives the great maxims of justice and charity from this concept, the concept of equality. And it's going to be interesting to see how this ringing endorsement of Hooker is going to inform Locke's famous theory of the law of nature, which we will discuss in the next section right now. Let's turn to that section, 2.3 in my book, Laws of Nature. In paragraph 4 of Second Treatise of Government, Locke declared that although men have perfect freedom in the state of nature, they are bound by the law of nature. This declaration prompts one to wonder how freedom can be perfect, as he said, and also bound by a law. It doesn't make any sense. And Locke compounds the confusion by writing that, quote, though men in the state of nature have not an uncontrollable liberty to dispose of his person or possessions, yet he has no liberty to destroy himself, or so much as any person in his possession, but where some nobler use than its bare preservation calls for it. That's from paragraph 6 of Second Treatise. In other words, we can do what we want with our bodies and possessions except commit suicide or kill others, unless we are forced to kill someone in self-defense or in defense of another. That's what he means by a nobler use. So if I might be justified in killing Tom if Tom is coming after my wife. That would be a nobler use. Let's look now at the first law of nature. Locke ignores the apparent contradiction in the quoted passage, and he continues in the next sentence of the same paragraph to write the famous words that many years later deeply influenced the political ideas of George Mason, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and other revolutionary British colonists in America. And here's his quote, and then I'll quote from the Declaration of Independence. Here's what Locke says, paragraph 6 of Second Treatise. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone. And reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another, in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Now compare that with the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Locke's short and complex sentence, which we quoted, played an important role in Second Treatise. It not only provides a theory about what makes an action morally right or wrong, but it lays the groundwork for Locke's later justification of punishment. He gave him a theory about the origin and justification of political authority, the ends of political society, the extent of legislative power, and justifiable responses to tyranny. So it's incumbent on us to look carefully at each part of that passage from paragraph 6 that I just quoted, and which was copied by Thomas Jefferson, who wrote these words for the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, and that we are all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Try to say the word unalienable 10 times quickly. Okay. First, Locke tells us that there is a law of nature that governs the state of nature. Second, reason is identical with the law of nature. Third, reason teaches all mankind who will but consult it that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Fourth, reason, which now we understand is the law of nature, teaches mankind that these are their duties because they are all men, are equal and independent. And by men, I'm using the generic word, although Locke wasn't. That includes both genders. Let's begin with the details of the law of nature. The law is prescriptive. It tells us that there are 4 kinds of harm that we ought not to inflict on others, thereby depriving them of life, health, liberty, or possessions. Although Locke does not mention it here, it later becomes clear that these deprivations are also violations of individual rights. The rights are reciprocal with the obligations. The obligation not to harm others in the ways specified are also violations of the right not to be harmed. Hence, the law of nature teaches us that not only do we have a duty not to deprive others of their life, health, liberty, or possessions, but for each of these named obligations, we have a reciprocal right not to be so deprived. Now, readers of Locke might object that Locke is simply asserting that there is a law of nature without giving any proof or argument to support this. And one question that a critic might ask is, why must there be any laws at all in the state of nature? It's not impossible to imagine a society in which each person creates her own laws, and no one takes the time to consult a universal law, nor even to inquire about the existence of such a law. This would surely be the perfect freedom to which Locke alluded earlier in paragraph 4 of Second Treatise. There's also some confusion about Locke's claim that reason and the law of nature are one and the same. To repeat what was said above, I'm sorry, what was said earlier, I'm talking to you now from the book. To repeat, if there is a law of nature, then it is prescriptive. The law tells us what we ought and ought not to do. Now, is reason also prescriptive? Locke elsewhere defines reason as a mental ability or a power to discover the certainty or probability of such propositions or truths which the mind arrives at by deduction. This is from his essay concerning human understanding in chapter 4, section 18. Look at the bibliography or look at the book, and you'll see what I'm quoting from. So the question is reason also prescriptive? And Locke defines reason as a mental ability or a mental power to discover the certainty or probability of propositions or truths which we come to by deduction. For example, if I am certain that Socrates is mortal, because Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, then this is due to a deduction that I have made from the premises, Socrates is a man and all men are mortal. And I'm certain because I cannot deny the conclusion while accepting the truth of these two premises. Reason forces me to accept the conclusion that Socrates is mortal. In that sense, we might come to think of reason, like the law of nature, as having a prescriptive function. Now, if we consult reason, then Locke tells us that it will teach us that the law of nature is true. Unfortunately, Locke leaves it up to the reader to do the deductions that are necessary to fulfill this promise. That is, he puts it on us. Now, we might begin this process by looking at two ideas mentioned by Locke in the preceding quote. The ideas are equality and independence. The argument would be this, that men and women in the state of nature have the obligations and the implied rights that are cited in the law of nature. Why? Because, first, all persons are morally equal, no one having any rights or duties that not possessed by others. And secondly, they are all independent in the sense that no person in the state of nature is dependent upon the will of any other man. Now, we should note that this is exactly how Locke defined perfect freedom in paragraph 4. But this does not get us to the law of nature as Locke describes it. Moral equality does not specify any moral obligations, or does it? Someone might say it only tells us that if John ought not to do a particular act, for example, commit theft or assault, then everyone else has the same obligation. It doesn't give us even a hint about the content of the obligation. Second, if being independent is being free, or not dependent on the will of any other man, then we have a worse problem. Locke has previously told us that being independent does not mean or imply that we are free from the restrictions imposed by the law of nature. But now look, this takes us full circle. If our attempt to derive the law of nature from the independence of humankind in the state of nature, we are told that there is an existing law of nature that governs and restricts this independence. Look, Locke has just assumed the very thing that he wants to prove. It's called, folks, circular reasoning. Here's a side